Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
Hi, this is Andy Strickler. I am currently the Dean of Admission and Financial Aid at Connecticut College, located in New London, Connecticut. I've also worked in athletics and admissions at Kalamazoo College, Beloit College, Sinus College, and Guilford College in Greensboro, North Carolina.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a wellness coach at the Keenan Flagler Business School at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. Good morning, friends. I'm coming to you from the Outer Banks, North Carolina. We have a family reunion, and 11 of us are here from California, Colorado, Georgia, North Carolina, and Ontario, Canada, and I could not be happier. Thanksgiving's around the corner, and I am just so thankful for so many things. I'm thankful to God. I'm thankful for the beautiful world God created, the nature, as I sit out here over the Atlantic with nothing but water in front of me. Thankful to my family, and I'm thankful to each and every one of you who listens to this podcast, especially those in our listening family who never miss an episode. I've just got one quick announcement today, and then we're going to get into today's episode. I want to thank all of you who recommended that your college counselor at your high school join our Counselors Connect group. Several of you reached out to me this week to let me know that you have spoken to your college counselor at your student school and recommended our podcast. And in two cases, people gave me the name of the school counselor, and I saw the counselor went ahead and applied to join our group. This is a great way to provide a resource to strengthen your own students' counselor's skill so they can more effectively help your student, but also all the students at your student's high school or CBO. We now have over 60 counselors that have applied, and just by us mentioning it on this podcast. And this week we had a real surge in public school, independent school, and CBO counselors. For a while, I was like, man, look at all these public counselors and independent school counselors coming in. And then I forgot I'd mentioned it on the podcast. And we currently have 50% of the people who have signed up are independent educational consultants, and 50% are school-based, public, private, and CBO. If you haven't reached out to your school-based counselor to let them know about this opportunity, please tell them just to go to yourcollegeboundkid.com, go to the resources page, and click Counselors Connect. It takes 60 seconds to complete the application, and we're definitely going to be giving priority for membership to those who meet our priority application date, which is December 10th, which is 15 days away. All right, friends, my plan before I left Georgia today was to not record any intro to our interviews. I'm currently here on vacation. I did all my recordings before the trip. Easy peasy. That was the plan. And then you'd get part 2 of the Andy Strickler interview about understanding early decision 1 and early decision 2. And then you get part 5 of the David Hawkins interview, where he looks at the 2 surveys they did, the one of colleges to see what matters most to them and how they make admissions decisions, and also their survey of 1,000 high school students to see what's the perception to high school students of what they think actually matters in college admissions. And just in general, what do they think about college? And you're going to get those 2 20-minute interview segments in today's episode. But one thing I like about having 2 episodes a week is that when news breaks, we can get it to you. And I know some of you are saying, Stuck, you're on vacation, enjoy yourself. Well, this is enjoying myself. I woke up excited to record an additional segment about some news that broke while everybody was still asleep. And I think it's going to land like an earthquake in the world of financial aid at elite college admissions. Before I get into this article, 2 listeners, one from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and one from Mequon, Wisconsin, mentioned to me this week how helpful they found the interview on 18 Reasons Why College Aid Awards vary so much from school to school. I was kind of a little hesitant to do that interview because I knew it was going to get really weedsy. But warning, what I share today may be even a deeper dive into the weeds in that interview. Based on that feedback, I know our listeners like depth. Warning, you're going to get a lot of depth. You're going to get a deep dive into the weeds. All right, let's dive right in. So the University of Pennsylvania released a bold, new, generous financial plan that I believe is going to shake up the world of elite college admissions and put so much pressure on their overlap schools, their competitors, to up the ante, to up their game, to increase their generosity, not just to under-resourced students, not just to the working class, not just to the middle class, but to the upper middle class. And I want to read a short article to you today that appeared in one of the several UPenn newspapers. They've got several. They've got the Daily Pennsylvanian. It was been around ever. And then this one is in Penn today. It went live a couple days ago. And the name of the article is Penn Expands Financial Aid for Middle-Income Families. So you're getting a bonus. You're getting an extra this week in the news this week. All right, here's the article. It's not too long. I'm just going to read it. The University of Pennsylvania today announced the Quaker Commitment, a sweeping new financial aid initiative designed to support families from middle-income backgrounds by increasing financial aid packages and guaranteeing full tuition scholarships to a greater number of students. Effective in the 2025-2026 academic year, so that's current seniors, by the way, it will start in fall of 2025, Penn will no longer consider the value of the primary family home among assets in determining the amount of financial aid eligibility and will raise the income threshold for families eligible to receive full tuition from $140,000 to $200,000 with typical assets. This bold new initiative expands financial aid for more families in alignment with our commitment to have Penn Financial Aid Package meet 100% of families' demonstrated need with no loans. And that's according to Penn's interim president, Larry Jamison. Jamison says, "We are proud to launch the Quaker Commitment, building on the university's commitment to opportunity and longstanding leadership in undergraduate financial aid. These initiatives affect all aid-eligible undergraduate students, not just entering first-year students. In other words, we're not only going to apply for students that come in the fall, but if you're already a current freshman, sophomore, junior, it will apply to you as well. You're just going to be paying a lot less next year." Goes on to say 46% of Penn's 10,000 undergraduate students currently receive aid. The average aid package is $70,579 per year, and that covers 76% of the total cost of attendance. It goes on to say that back in 2008, before they launched their no loan financial aid policy, Penn's aid covered 57%. So they're making the point, we've gone from covering 57% of our total costs to 76% of the total costs for those who receive aid. All right, the article says, Penn is only one of a handful of universities to exclude home equity when determining a student's expected family contribution. Now, to be honest with you, that's not actually an accurate statement. What they should have said is Penn is only a handful of universities that use the CSS profiles, what they should have said. Because for the about 180, 190 schools that use the CSS profile, most schools do use home equity. For majority of colleges that only use the FAFSA, they do not use home equity for your primary residence. Just a little correction there. Just want to correct that there just so it's more accurate. All right, so it goes on to say, let me read that again. Penn is only one of a handful of universities to exclude home equity when determining a student's expected family contribution, the amount they're asked to pay using financial aid information submitted by the family. This is expected to impact about 900 current students, and they should see an extra $4,000 in grants in their package. And then the article says that getting rid of that threshold, moving it from $140,000, which is what they previously said, you made $140,000 or less, you paid no tuition, to $200,000, that's going to impact another 180 students, and they're going to get an extra $10,000 per year of grants that the family doesn't have to pay, that Penn's going to pick up. The article says the Quaker Commitment builds on last year's expansion of the Penn's financial aid program and the Penn First Plus initiative for lower-income families. In 2023, Penn announced that beginning with the 2023-2024 academic year, students whose families make $75,000 or less with typical assets, and I'll come back to that typical assets in a second, and that's up from $65,500 2 years ago, would receive financial aid, listen to this, that covers tuition, fees, housing, dining with grants, and work study. This increase impacted 200 students, and that increased their average annual package by $16,000. So they've been taking gradual steps back to 2008 to make packages better, and that's basically what they're saying here. Now, then the article says, this new program is the latest step of Penn's effort to widen access for students of all economic backgrounds while specifically responding to the needs of the middle and the upper middle class. It says Penn is reaffirming its commitment to the core principle that a world-class education can be affordable for students of all backgrounds, not just from the lower income backgrounds or from those who are able to pay full. And that's according to Mark Dinfield, who's the vice president for finance as well as the treasurer. He says, we're updating these policies because it's the right thing to do for our students and families. Okay, I'm almost done the article. The Quaker commitment is designed specifically for the middle income families who we hear from who, even after receiving a need-based financial aid package with no loans, they still face difficulty in meeting the expected family contribution. That's according to Elaine Ferris, the Senior University Director of Financial Aid. And friends, this isn't in the article, but I had a student last year who would be at Penn right now if they would have had this policy in place last year. So what happened was she applied regular decision. It was her top choice, but it wasn't affordable. And I know the details of the financial circumstance, and had this plan been in place, this student would be at UPenn right now. So this can make a real difference in the lives of real people. I have somebody absolutely in mind who would be at Penn had they done this a year ago. The article goes on to say these new initiatives will help close the gap for those families to make it easier for them to commit to Penn and ease their financial pressures. And it goes on to say this is going to cost $6 million a year for us to do this. And we're seeking donors to raise the money through endowed funds to provide sustainable support for the future. Okay. Now, did you catch the word upper middle class in what I read? Let me read that part again. This new program is the latest step in Penn's efforts to widen access for students from all economic backgrounds while specifically responding to the needs of the middle and upper middle income families. Wow. Now, a lot of times when I talk about early decision, who it's best for, I talk about it from a barbell perspective, meaning both extremes of the economic spectrum. People who have so much money that they do not need to compare financial aid awards, and under-resourced families who need very generous aid award in it, and they need that extra admissions boost they get when they apply early decision, that extra thumb on the scale, to apply to schools that meet full demonstrated need. And these schools are hard to get into, so if they didn't apply ED, then they may not get in, and they may end up choosing from colleges that are not as generous and will ultimately cost them more. And I had this very conversation with Andy Strickler in the exact same interview you're about to listen to, and he specifically drew on two specific students from his school that fell in that category. That's often how I framed it. Well, that is not correct anymore when it comes to University of Pennsylvania. If a family makes $200K with typical assets, tuition is going to be zero. I looked it up, and there are 15% of the families in this country that make $200,000. So you may not feel upper middle class if you make $200,000, but you are upper middle class, definitionally, because you're in the top 1/7 of the country in family income. Now, that isn't upper class, but it is upper middle class, and tuition is free at Penn, effective current senior class, starting in fall 2025. Now, keep in mind, if you're right at that $200K level, you will have $6,500 in student fees, approximately. You still have meals and housing. You still have books, supplies. You still have transportation and spending money. So sometimes people think tuition is the whole kit and caboodle, the whole ball of wax. So you're still looking at about $40,000, even with free tuition. But that's like the price of many in-state flagship schools. Okay? Many times people look at a place like Penn and they say $97,000, I can never afford that. Well, how about $40,000 or $37,000? Okay, and that's at incomes of $200,000. If your income is under $140,000, it's going to be significantly less because now they're going to pick up those fees I told you about, that $6,500 in fees, they're going to pick up meals and housing, which is close to 20. All right. And now you're looking at way cheaper than almost any school that you could ever go to if you're living in the dorms. All right. Now, I know what some of you are saying. What if my income is $250,000? Do I miss out on this whole perk entirely? Well, the first $200,000 would be protected from tuition. Okay. I know what others are saying. What are typical assets? Now, they have to add this disclaimer in there because the formula that looks at need-based financial aid looks at the income and assets of the student and the income and assets of the family. But you heard the word assets, right? So what if somebody has abundant assets? What if, for example, a family has 4 rental properties, a trust fund, $500,000 in their 529 account, $1 million in stocks in a brokerage account, not a retirement account, brokerage account, $100,000 just in cash for emergency savings, $50,000 in money market accounts, compared to someone else who doesn't have any of that stuff? That's not the same family. So that's why they say typical assets, because there's no way you can have some descriptor that would cover everybody. And approximately 5% of assets per year are expected to go to your expected family contribution or your student aid index, according to the CSS profile formula. So many colleges just use the term typical assets as a generic way to mean not unusually high assets. You need to talk to each school to find out what typical assets means for them, according to how they're using the definition. But I personally think it's fair to use that term, typical assets. Because look, it took me like 90 seconds to explain typical assets to you. Do you want to have to say all that every single time you try to explain this policy? Of course not. So you just use the catchphrase typical assets. It kind of covers you in case someone has abundant assets and then they, of course it wouldn't apply to them. Now, believe it or not, the boldest part of this initiative may not even be shielding $200,000 with typical assets from paying tuition. It's the combination of that cap and the fact that home equity for your primary home is being excluded from the formula. Friends, I once had a conversation with an admissions dean. This is back in 2018. And this is at one of the hardest schools to get into, a school, pretty abundant resources. Definitely a school that meets full demonstrated need and always has, as long as I've been doing this work. And the admission director said to me, do you know how much more money we would need in our budget to exclude home equity from financial aid? There's no way we could do that. Now, if you heard my conversation with Bucknell's Director of Financial Aid, Aaron Wolf, about 18 reasons why financial aids differ so much from school to school, you know that what inspired me to do that interview again, and I say again, because I did the same interview back in 2018 with David Jelinas, one of the giants in the field. You can look it up. It's interview 10 that we ever did on Your College Bound Kid. So why do it again? Well, I know that not everyone looks at 7-year-old interviews. You just don't. That's one reason. But I was also inspired because last year I had a student that got 0 need-based aid at one school, one Ivy League school that gives no merit-based money. And then at another Ivy League school, they got $60,000. And then another Ivy League school matched that $60,000 that they got. So 2 schools offered 60 and one offered 0. And that not only happened to me again this week, it got surpassed. I worked with a new transfer student, and they had a $70,000 difference between their best award and another award from 2 schools that say they meet full demonstrated need. I'm not talking about merit money. So anyway, anytime that happens to me, if it's schools that don't give merit-based money, the first reason that comes to my mind of the 18 that Aaron and I talked about, the first reason that pops into my head is how is the school handling home equity? What is their home equity policy? Are they counting all of it? Are they counting none of it, or somewhere in between? It can make a huge difference in your aid award. Let's say we have a teacher making $80,000 a year. And let's say they have a spouse, works part-time while taking care of kids at home. They make an extra $15,000. So this family's making $95,000 a year, And let's say they bought their home 20 years ago for $200,000 and now it's gone up to $1 million. Okay, and let's say they've paid down that $200,000 mortgage and they owe $50,000 on that mortgage. So they have $950,000 home equity. Did you catch that? 1 million value minus the $50,000 they still owe equals $950,000 of home equity. Well, the CSS profile takes 5% of your assets and expects them to go to the cost of college every single year. So 5% of $950,000 is $47,500 just off of home equity every single year. Now, let's assume they have no other assets, no emergency fund, no stocks, no bonds, no cash, no money market, no rental properties, no mutual fund, no trust funds, nothing outside of this home equity in their primary account. Well, $47,500 per year is expected to go to the college, but remember, this is after tax money. If they live in a high tax state, that $47,500 may be $80,000 in earnings. So how in the heck are they supposed to pay $95,000 of their $80,000 in earnings to generate $47,500 after tax money? You can't do it. And Penn's plan not only shields that first $150,000 for a couple, $75,000 for a single, from all tuition fees, meals, housing, but now your home equity is protected. Yale doesn't do this. In fact, Yale made a big announcement last year, 2023, saying that they were going to move from having a 3.0 multiplier to a 2.4 multiplier on home equity. I know this is getting weedsy, but stick with me. What does that mean? It means that if a family made $100,000 a year, in the past, if you times that $100,000 by 3, you would get $300,000. And only $300,000, let's say they sold that $1 million home, only $300,000 of that million would go into the formula. So you take 5% of that $300,000 and $15,000 per year would be expected to go to college. So when they shifted to the 2.4 multiplier, now you times 2.4 times 100,000, you get 240,000, you times that by 5%, and you'd be paying $12,000 every year just off your home equity with being a student aid index. All right, but this is going to be zero for Penn student. So 12,000 times 4 is 48,000. That's 48,000 saved for the Penn student versus the Yale student. And once again, that's after tax money. So when you look at endowment per student, which is not, it's an imperfect metric. One of these days I'll do a deep dive into why it's an imperfect metric. It's beyond the scope of this conversation, but it's still one of the best ways of comparing resources of one private school to another. Yale is second only to Princeton. Okay, and Penn is 30th in endowment per student. Let me tell you a little secret. All of these Ivy League schools and all of these Ivy League peer schools, they're all watching their back to see what their competitors do. They're extremely competitive with each other. They want to maintain their station. They don't want to slip in their perception with the public. They don't want to be seen as not at the same tier or not offering the same thing to their students. Secret. They all watch each other's back and make adjustments when one does something. All right. Now, colleges do not always readily disclose their home equity policy. You may remember I also mentioned in my interview with Aaron Wolf that I was meeting over lunch with a financial aid officer from an elite school, and I asked what multiplier they used, and he wouldn't tell me. Well, I never named that school in that discussion, but I'm feeling a little frisky today. I'm feeling a little feisty today. So I'll name that school. It was Johns Hopkins. Now, in fairness to Johns Hopkins, they've made one of the boldest commitments in the last little while. Of course, they got $1.2 billion from Michael Bloomberg. That helps, right? To first go to not be need aware anymore. And then since then, they've added additional things like no loans, and they've really beefed up their policy. So no shade at Johns Hopkins. But the point is, people can be a little defensive and not want to share what their multiplier is. Now, Paula Bishop is a financial aid expert in the Pacific Northwest, and she tracks home equity policies better than anyone that I'm aware of. And the last time I saw her research, there were only 17 colleges in the country that use the CSS profile, also known as institutional methodology, that exclude home equity into their calculations. And if you have a lot of home equity, you need to know that. So now Penn makes 18 that do not count home equity. Now, let's take a look at these 18 schools. There are 6 of them that you would expect would be on that list because they're, first of all, the 5 highest endowments per student in the country. 7 of the schools with the highest endowment in the country, 6 of them are on this list. So they're ones you would expect: Stanford, Princeton, Harvard, MIT, Caltech, and the University of Chicago. All right? So no surprise there. You would expect, well, the wealthiest schools in the country have the resources to be able to do something like this. But some are on this list that are quite wealthy, but not in the top 15 schools of the wealthiest, and they're also on this list. When I say this list, I'm talking about schools that exclude home equity from their formula, even if they require the CSS profile and they use institutional methodology. Here I'm talking about Hamilton, USC, not South Carolina, University of Southern California, University of Virginia, Cooper Union. All right. There's another 7 that are nowhere near, not just the top 15 wealthiest schools, nowhere near the top 100 wealthiest schools in endowment per student, and they also exclude home equity. So if they can do it, why can't others? And who's on that list? DePauw in Indiana, Elon in North Carolina, Bard in New York, George Washington in D.C., Ursinus in Pennsylvania, Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, Whitman in Walla Walla, Washington. If these schools can exclude home equity in the calculations, what about the wealthiest schools in the country that are still using home equity? I think Penn's combination of free tuition, which is a $60,000 savings per year, plus excluding home equity is going to put major pressure on other elite wealthy colleges to follow suit. Those who see themselves as in Penn's tiers. Ivy schools and Ivy Plus, not just that group that calls itself the Ivy Plus group. There's other schools that are seen as or see themselves as Ivy caliber schools, not just in selectivity, but also in resources. All right, who am I talking about? I'm going to name names. I'm talking about Columbia. I'm talking about Dartmouth. I'm talking about Duke. I'm talking about Cornell. I'm talking about Williams. I'm talking about Amherst. I'm talking about Pomona. I'm talking about Swarthmore. I'm talking about Rice and Vanderbilt and Notre Dame, Northwestern, WashU. Now, I'm not calling out these schools because I look at the increased aid commitments recently announced by WashU, by Duke, by Rice, and they're very impressive, much, much better than anything they've ever done before. But no school with Penn's resources quite doing what Penn is doing with this bold new announcement, and I still see those other schools upping their game. I was a director of annual giving in 2001. I worked very closely with their major gift officers, and you better believe the major gift officers are going to be hitting up their donors, trying to get them to launch initiatives to match or one-up Penn. Now, MIT announced this week they're doing the same thing as Penn. They're going to free tuition for the exact same income, $200,000 and less, and MIT was already on that short list of schools that wasn't counting home equity. Now, did they follow suit with Penn? Was it immediately a knee-jerk reaction and some donor stepped and gave money? Possibly. Usually these things are done well in advance, so perhaps it's coincidental. But even if it's true, that's even more momentum. Penn and MIT. Now 2 schools doing this. $200K or less, no tuition, as long as you have typical assets, and exclude home equity in their formula and in their calculations. Now, I've been thinking a lot. Should home equity be in the formula? Should home equity literally be part of something that increases the amount you have to pay for college? And I'm torn because on the one hand, it's kind of what I said before. If you're sitting around with $2 million in home equity in your home, and then you also have, all these other resources, and somebody else is a renter, you're not the same family. And if a school's trying to give money to people who really need it, a case can be made. You have abundance of resources available at your disposal. But on the other hand, FAFSA schools don't count home equity. On the other hand, should you really be tempted, or should you really be expected to have to tap your own home equity to pay for college? Should you have to take out either a home equity loan or a home equity line of credit? Is that really what we've come to? I see both arguments. But the reality is colleges want to be able to say they meet full demonstrated need. Not only does it sound very appealing to families, but they want to be grouped in with that prestigious tier of schools that make this claim. And some schools really stretch it in order to be able to say we meet full demonstrated need. I'm sorry, I'm going to name names. American University, Boston College, NYU. they're notorious for poor aid awards because they ask their homeowners to pay so much of their equity toward the cost of college. So that's why you see really bad need-based award packages from American University, Boston College, and NYU. And there's others. I just pointed out a few. If home equity was excluded, very few schools would be able to say they meet full demonstrated need. And so I think the pressure Penn is putting on other schools is a very good thing to stop using home equity and to increase the amount of money that's shielded from being used to have to go toward tuition. All right. Hopefully you stayed with me. I know I got way off in the weeds, but you guys tell me that's why you like your college-bound kid. So I'm testing that theory. But let's transition to what I think was an outstanding interview with Andy Strickler, the Chief Enrollment Officer at Connecticut College, where we do a deep dive into early decision 1 and 2.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, in part 2 of 4, Andy explains what the basic difference is between early decision 1 and early decision 2, also known as ED1 and ED2. Andy explains the behavioral characteristic differences between ED1 and ED2, and he goes into this with some depth. Andy shares what the ED1 admit rate is at Connecticut College and what the ED2 admit rate is at Connecticut College. And Andy shares why the ED2 admit rate is significantly lower than the ED1 admit rate. Andy also shares how the ED2 admit rate would change if they removed high-need international students. Andy responds to a few reasons I have heard that the ED2 admit rate is oftentimes lower than the ED1 admit rate. And he provides some commentary on that. Listen and enjoy.
The common topic that you hear all the time is artificial intelligence, and we be dumb to bury our heads in the sand and pretend that artificial intelligence, our AI, is not going to impact higher ed. So data and predictive modeling, which influences our everyday world, assuming it's not going to impact selection criteria in a public environment in higher education, I think is burying your head in the sand. Of course it is. You know, more and more institutions are going to start thinking about this stuff in data-oriented ways.
That's a perfect segue. Let's get into the difference between ED1 and ED2. We've had 2 questions sent in from listeners on this, which we'll play in this podcast. One was specifically directed to your school based on comments you made. But let's just start out with the basics. You know, what's the difference between ED1 and ED2, early decision 1, early decision 2? And we'll go from there.
I mean, the basics are the timing is different. ED1, the deadline's November 15th. We're going to release mid-December. ED2, the app deadline is January 15th, and we're going to release mid-February. You know, at your core, at the high level sort of definitional position, that's the difference between ED1 and ED2. It's just same program, different time of year. Now, the behavioral characteristics of ED1 and ED2 can be very different.
That's what I want you to talk about.
Okay. That's what you want me to talk about. Okay. Well, then, seriously, I'm not sure we have enough time to talk about that.
I got plenty of time.
Okay. So I think one of the major changes or differences between ED1 and ED2, a couple of them. First, the vast majority of athletic recruitment at the Division III level, and probably even the Division I level, happens in early decision 1. Okay. There are not that many athletes who end up in ED2. Second is, think about the characteristics that we just used, the actual letters and numbers. ED1 versus ED2. One is clearly a first choice institution. That's where you apply ED1. Okay. ED2, you know, just by its name for many students then becomes a second choice institution? And how many students feel strongly enough about their second choice institution that they would choose to go early decision? Okay.
Hmm.
It's a slightly different mindset. Most students get to the point where they visit colleges and they're thinking this through, and then they're like, this is my first choice. And then there's everybody else. Not many people rank order and be like, this is number one, this is number two, this is number three, this is number four. They're like, that's my spot.
Well, especially when committing to that means I forego seeing where out. Not it's not I mean, not only just the money thing. It's like, gee, I'm super curious where I'd get in some of these other schools, and I'm foregoing that
Yeah,
opportunity to consider those as an option.
exactly. ED1 is theoretically, it's a spot that you feel so strongly about that you're willing to forego opportunities at another place. It's basically like you go to the prettiest girl in school and say, listen, I'm going to the prom with you, or I'm not going to the prom, period. Not going to wait. I'm not going to ask anybody else. It's you or nobody else.
The only thing I would say, Andy, over the last, I can't quantify how many years, but every year I see the growth of the more strategic ED,
Totally.
right? Which is, I know it's my best shot. Where can I take my best shot that has a chance of maybe coming to fruition? I'm thinking of a conversation with a student from New Jersey I keep having this year, and
Yeah.
she keeps asking what I think her chances are, which is always really, really hard when you're applying to these schools and
Yeah.
deny more kids than they admit. And I keep saying to her, I won't be surprised if you get in. I won't be surprised if you don't. You've earned the right for this to be an ED1 school. And she has gone back and forth with me over 3 different schools for an ED1.
Right.
She talked to me about Northwestern University, Vanderbilt University, and Emory University. And at one point, Cornell was also in those discussions about where she should ED. Because she would like to get this thing over. And if it means she's aiming too high, so
Right.
there's that aspect of it. There's the strategy piece that certain more well-resourced, a little more sophisticated families play that game now in a way that they didn't as much years ago.
Absolutely. And the reality is they're like, all right, we're going to go ED1, and that's our top dog. And then, the reality is that we're going to be looking at one of two decisions, which is an admit or a deferral. Those are probably the more prevalent of the two admission decisions that are going to occur in ED1, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And therefore, you're forced with a tough decision as to, okay, do I hang on for the deferral to RD for the school that's definitely top of my list, or do I want to forego that answer in March to throw an ED2 app somewhere else?
The only thing I would throw in, Andy, and different schools have different philosophies with how they see ED, right? So
Right.
it's not necessarily correlate to the selectivity of the school. So there are schools, and I've seen schools change over some maybe 5 to 10 years ago, that if you get deferred, it's an indication that you are close. And there's schools that are denying. These are some of the most selectives,
Right.
right? Dukes and Browns and Columbias. They're denying the vast majority of their ED pool. Then there's other places that aren't really denying that many. And
Right.
even that this is not a school that has early decision, MIT, but it's as selective as it gets, they're deferring 70%. So that's just a philosophical approach that a school, I personally am in the camp of, if you're really unlikely to take someone, cut them loose and let
Yeah.
them fall in love somewhere else, because then they'll linger on. But I
Yep.
don't get to dictate the policies.
True. I know a school that'll defer if a student applies ED1 and they're going to defer the student. They don't defer the student to regular. They defer the student to ED2.
Yeah.
And therefore, the student is forced into a dilemma. Do I stick with school A for ED2, or do I pull it
Yeah.
and then go ED2 somewhere else?
And I can see that growing in popularity too. I'm gonna
Totally.
force your hand here.
Go for it.
So I'm just gonna ask you a straight up question. Some schools answer this honestly. You're the kind of guy that will answer this. what's your acceptance rate in ED1 versus ED2?
I actually pulled the data up before we got on there.
Now you're really impressing me.
Our admit rate for ED1 is 50 to 60% most
Okay.
years.
Yep.
Our admit rate for ED2, 20 to 25%.
All right, great. This is what I want to talk about. So
Yep.
it would be fair to say that ED2 admit rate is always going to be lower than ED1 admit rate, right? Always. It may differ, but it's not going to be
I think that
higher.
is a safe assumption, yes.
So let's talk about the reasons. Why is the ED2 admit rate lower than the ED1 admit rate? These are some of the questions our listeners have been asking.
That's the easiest question you're going to ask me.
Yep.
Ready? I have
The pool
three
is not
words
as
for you.
strong.
Nope.
Go ahead.
High need international students.
Oh, there you go.
Yep. So our ED1 pool and most ED1 pools
Yep.
at selective places
Yep.
are going to be flush with very talented international students who have significant levels of financial need.
Yep.
Okay. And when many of these students do not succeed in gaining an offer of admission from their ED1 school, they will then throw an ED2 app out there almost immediately. So our ED2 pool is artificially buttressed by a significant number of high need international students, and we'll admit a handful of them. But we have a limited financial aid budget. We'll admit some in ED2, ED1. We'll admit a few more in ED2, but we want to preserve some spots for regular decision because we get great applicants in regular decision. But there's a very limited number that we can say yes to. And for schools that live in our particular neighborhood, and these are fairly selective to pretty selective places that guarantee to meet full demonstrated need, that are need aware for domestic and international students, and that's a pretty good cohort of schools, that's a valid data point for all of us. Our international applicant pools continue to go up. They continue to sort of self-select into early decision, trying to secure that offer of admission and matching financial aid award. And we're not in a position where we can offer more students admission and financial aid than we could 3 or 4 years ago. So the admit rate's going to be lower because most of your athletic recruitment is already done. You're going to have a handful of domestic ED2 apps in there. But the high need international population is what's going to drive that admit rate down pretty significantly.
Do you feel if you were to take out the internationals, would the ED2 admit rate still be lower than the ED1 admit rate? Well, you have the athletes there for one, so that's a big factor.
The reality is I would say it would be the same or maybe even a little bit higher.
Well, I wasn't expecting you to say that about higher.
Yeah, it could be a little bit higher depending on the year.
And tell me why it may be higher.
Well, if you totally remove the high need international students and you're looking at qualified domestic students, and particularly I'm thinking about high need domestic students, many of whom are going to be first generation, who have worked with either independent school counselors or CBO counselors who are sophisticated and savvy and say your best chance of getting a significant need-based financial aid award is to roll the dice in ED. I think that population would be enough that the admit rate would be about the same or probably higher.
So I want to bounce something off you because I'll tell you two reasons I've heard from other people I've talked to about why their ED2 admit rate is lower. And I'll see how this resonates with your experience.
Okay.
Both at Conn as well as just kind of your knowledge of the national landscape, So one is in ED1, we need every kind of kid.
Right.
We need every kind of kid. But if we get a pretty significant chunk that come in, we're already starting to shape our class in ED2. We're already starting to say, you know what? We got absolutely killed and we didn't get any boys from Ohio.
Right.
So you're already starting to niche target areas where your applicant pool may be soft in a way that you're not doing in ED1. Does that resonate at all? What are your thoughts on that?
I think for an ultra selective place, that's totally the case.
Mm-hmm.
I think for a moderately selective, need aware, tuition driven place,
Mm-hmm.
it's going to be a little bit different.
Friends, I hope you are picking up something that Andy has clearly referred to twice now. Tuition-driven schools make many decisions where they have to take money into consideration. Hillary brought up this a few weeks ago when we were discussing admissions travel. The ability to pay impacts the bills and admission decisions far more than you will ever understand if you just rely on your knowledge from information sessions that you attend. And I'm just grateful that at your college bound kid, we have 2 admissions practitioners that serve as our co-hosts, the chief admission officer at Connecticut College and an assistant director of admission at Colorado College, who both give you the truth, who both give you straight talk. But take note that money comes into play a lot more than people understand at private schools. Yep, that's a really good point.
Yep.
All of those points you said. Moderate selectivity and tuition driven, because you're still locking in some full pay families that help with your budget and your net tuition revenue.
Exactly. Or if you end up with some socioeconomic diversity in ED2, you can lock that in and then slide your admits in a different direction in regular.
Yep.
So you are checking off institutional objectives. It's just a question of which ones present themselves in the ED2 pool.
Boy, this is great. This is awesome. This is good stuff. Friends, this concludes this part of my interview with Andy Strickler, where he answers 20 frequently asked questions about early decision. Hope you'll join us next week for the next segment.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, in the final part of my interview with David Hawkins, David continues talking about the anxiety students are experiencing. David talks about what students thought about the communication they received from colleges. And David and I have a robust conversation speculating why the students feel the way they feel. David talks about what students shared about the pressures they are feeling. David talks about the selectivity fallacy. David talks about conspicuous consumption. And David goes on the hot seat in the lightning round. Listen and enjoy.
One of the other key findings that I thought was really interesting, and it sort of ties to this sort of rigidity of perception about how this thing works, and that is that about 73%, so almost 3/4 of the students we surveyed said that they worried that a small mistake on their application could affect their chances of being accepted. And there's a question. I'd almost turn the tables and pose a question to you, because you work directly with students.
Sure.
Which is that, for me, a small sort of mistake, I think, at least from what I hear from admissions officers, is easily enough rectified. But, there's clearly, this is a process where students are very stressed out. And, we are constantly trying to think, how do we make this less of a stressful thing? Because again, what you've done over your entire K-12 schooling is so important. And then where you go next is you're going to do equally well. It's just this area of high anxiety. And I guess for me, that prompted the question of, gosh, I wonder which mistakes they're really focused on and which ones really feel like, geez, is this going to sink my chances?
Well, I'll tell you, my sense is any mistake. The anxiety is so high.
Yeah.
And I have robust proof of that. I'll literally give you something that happened last week. So I had a parent reach out to me and very stress-laden email. And so the parent had put, now this is in the parent portion of the Common App.
Mm-hmm.
They had put that they completed law school in 2021, not 2001.
Oh.
And they were very, very concerned this was going to sink their kids' chances.
Really?
Yes. So, I was able to, calm their fears and let them know, well, people are used to mistakes, typo here or there, little thing that happens all the time, but that's I only shared that with you because it was so recent. Like, I mean, I could keep going for hours with examples, but yeah, there's the fear that it's going to all come down because of a typo.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely out there.
That's fascinating. And one of the findings we had in here was that a significant number, a majority of students felt that they would have benefited from better communication with the folks in the admission office, particularly the folks that they were most directly sort of connected to, such as a regional representatives, whoever was in charge of their region.
That's a tough one
It
because
is.
it almost reminds me, I bet if you surveyed students and asked a similar question about their counselor in their high school, they would say the same thing, especially if they're at a large
Yes.
public school with 250 to 1 ratio or 400 to 1 ratio, right? And that's kind of what that reminds me of. Like the financial model is difficult to make that level of personalization work, given the ratio of applicants to admission officers. Now, it doesn't mean there's not something that people can learn from that and apply in some way, right? Like,
Right.
I mean, there's schools out here doing interview processes, not as evaluative interviews, but just to make the school feel high touch.
Yeah.
Just more of an information interview, but make the school feel high touch, make you feel like. So, there might be some things that schools might be able to look into with recruiting volunteers or using alumni or something like that. But I think there might be a bit of a unrealistic expectation between the perception of how much time somebody can spend with you, given what the financial budget of the admission office is, given the number of applicants.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And what I thought was interesting about this too, Mark, is that having the benefit of having applied to college in the 1980s, back when we were banging these things out on typewriters, you couldn't really get in touch with the admissions office. Like, I guess if you were enterprising, you could call, but you didn't know who you're supposed to speak to. You could ask for the dean, or the likelihood of getting that person was pretty low. I've noticed that now most colleges list their admissions officers, tell you what territory they cover. So you can say, oh, I'm from Virginia. This person has the Mid Atlantic, so that's the person I should talk to. I have found, in fact, that the admissions offices are way more open than they ever were when I was young. And that, in fact, when we sort of step back and think about these ideas of colleges looking at how interested you are in applying, that it makes a lot of sense for you to reach out, especially if you are truly interested, to initiate that conversation. And certainly when my children were going through the process, they had the benefit of having, NACAC dad involved with them. But, I encourage them, hey, if you have a question, just email the person you met, at your high school, and they'll get right back to you. And they generally did. So I think that's one of the things where I feel like that one of the things that we look at in a survey like this is, where can we as an association start to create messaging and awareness that, hey, these admissions officers are there to help you. Counselors, college advisors, IECs, they're all out there. It's just a matter of getting you in touch with the folks who will know your case and your interest best. So so that one was one that we came back and we thought, oh, that's really interesting. We should probably work on that a little more as NACAC. But and I guess probably in overall, the survey played out. You've mentioned a couple times that these survey data are quite in harmony with things that you see every day.
Definitely.
Some of the things that we saw, students feeling pressured to apply to schools they weren't really interested in.
Yeah.
Students not applying to schools because they felt confident that they weren't going to get in. And of course, that's a bit of a double-edged sword.
Sure.
But, in research, we talk about undermatching. So you worry
Sure.
if students are highly qualified and could get in, but still don't.
The first point you made there is really a
Yeah.
difficult one because, boy, the kids have a lot of stuff coming at them. Like,
Yes.
especially if they're coming from a upper middle class environment, public or private, because it's a combination normally of parents and students, and both of them are so powerful. So there's the students in there. Unfortunately, there's this perception out here, and particularly in more affluent suburbs and private schools, where they judge schools by their acceptance rates. And this pecking order hierarchy emerges of what they think is a good school or a bad school based on what two things: what their peers tell them. Oh, I'm visiting that school. Oh, you know, and visiting. Oh, wow, and that happens on acceptances, and even on visits. And this is stuff they tell you when you counsel. They say it all the time. I was talking 2 years ago from a student from North Jersey, and she was telling me about a school that I had put on her list, you know, and it was, pretty reputable. I'll mention the name. It was Bard. And she reported how terrible she felt about this school when she would mention it to people at her school that, and so it was terrible. So I had to try to resurrect that, and I'm working against this massive peer culture
Mm-hmm.
for a school that you and I know is a really reputable school, right? I
Right.
mean,
Right.
and then it can also really happen with parents because it's just so hard for parents to understand how things have changed. I said to one the other day, double parents, they both went to Wash U, and I said, yeah, you went in the early 90s when they're admitting more than 60%,
Right.
you know?
Right.
Like now their regular decision admit rate is going to be single digits.
Yeah.
So that's really difficult. This is a great family. They received it really well. But people can't understand how things have changed so drastically.
Right.
Then you do have, like, let's face it, it's a reality. There's a certain pressure, unfortunately, in a lot of places. The sweatshirt, the bumper sticker, that's a definite reality that parents can feel about saving face in parent communities. Kids can feel it. It takes every skill that you have as a counselor to push back against the pressures that kids have of what they are convinced is a good school or a bad school. Sometimes you go into counseling and you're just, back of your mind, you're like, oh my goodness, like this in this family is just gonna feel so insulted when you mention such and such school, or if you give them a little guidance on their chances, and you have to explain to them that that school is actually a long shot or a real reach. So all these pressures are so real,
Yeah.
and they all contribute to, I think, some of what you're saying. But you also bring out the balancing part. You have to be careful with the undermatching too. Like that can also happen. But that tends to happen, my experience, that tends to happen more with more under-resourced families. I find more highly resourced families are swinging for the fences
Oh,
all the time with
totally.
the expectation that it's a coin toss or whatever. That's just my
Right.
experience. Yeah.
Well, and that's probably a good point to sort of land with sort of come back to this idea of the centrality of the student in all of this. To as parents, and I'll speak for all parents in some ways. We get wrapped up in a lot of things that aren't necessarily in the student's or the child's best interest, and
Hmm.
certainly there is. You mentioned what I call the sort of selectivity quality fallacy, that selectivity does not equal quality. It just equals how many students they're going to reject. the because there are a lot of schools providing amazing educations for a whole range of everybody from the highest testing person and the highest achieving person down to the person who has not yet caught a passion for learning, right? That
Sure.
those institutions are there, and they're the more important, I would argue, to our collective well-being than those highly selectives actually are. um, and then the other is just that, again, we look to our students. We have to look beyond the kinds of superficial things. There's an author named Thorstein Veblen who wrote in the early 1900s about conspicuous consumption, and the idea that we purchase more, we accumulate things that will conspicuously demonstrate how wealthy or how privileged we are, right? And that bumper sticker, that sweatshirt, that that to me falls into that category. Unless that school is the perfect fit for your or
Sure.
one of a really great fit for your student.
Yeah, sometimes I emphasize this so much I don't want to give the impression it's not an anti-selective school thing. Like that
Right,
sometimes a
right.
selective school is a great fit, but it's just striking that back. It's not, you know, I had a parent say something to me last night. I was really happy. He's went to Stanford himself, and he's like, has going to Stanford helped me? Yes. But is it the most important thing? Absolutely not.
Right.
And this is a parent who's very open to his daughter not going to big brand name schools because he's just seen over the course of my life, it's not the most important thing. It's just not. There's other things that are a lot more important.
That's right. And based on each student's personal characteristics, where they are in life at this time, all of that's gonna factor into the equation. And I've seen it play out myself. With my children and other young people that have been around. It's more. What is more important than the name of the school is what you do when you're there, and that just and of course the fit that you experience. So you might transfer one or two times. A lot of students do that, but the bottom line is, and Mark, I think this is as good a place as any to sort of really drive home the point that led us to this survey in the first place, is that we are involved in the education system as educators. We are here to help the students, without whom there is no education, there is no institution of higher education. And this is one of the first times in their lives that students are going to be able to make a decision that's going to affect the rest of their lives. It may not be determinant of the rest of their lives, but it will have an effect on their lives. And they're finally at this point where they can have some agency in that decision. So we feel like, in order, both on the individual level and on the large national sort of scale where we operate, we have to get better at thinking about where students, perspectives are critical to everything we do. So that is this. I should say that this survey is available for free on the NACAC website. Should feel free to promote this, let folks look at it.
Yeah, Dave, if you want to send me the link, I'll make sure you get it in our show notes. I
Yeah,
would
sure.
love to be able to share it for people. I know our listeners, and I know they'll click it and they'll imbibe it. They really will.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
you know.
Yeah.
So listen, before we let you go, no first-time guest gets away without going on what we call our hot seat in our lightning round.
All right.
You ready for some non-admission questions?
Yes, indeed.
So, what's your favorite snack?
Favorite snack. I'm not going to be good at this hot seat thing. I have to say chocolate. That's the thing
Chocolate.
that I reach for. Yep.
Awesome. What's your favorite sport?
Sport. Growing up, I was a American football fan, so I'm just going to go with that.
What's your team?
Green Bay Packers.
Oh, you still a Packer fan?
Yeah.
Oh, you're not the only one. That's a loyal bunch there. That's a loyal bunch. What's the dream vacation? What's on the bucket list? The place you want to go you haven't been to?
Wow, the place I'd want to go that I haven't been to. I would have to say I've never been to East Asia, so Japan has been on my list for a long time. I'm going to go with Japan.
That's another group that's got a passionate group of followers. Boy, the people that are into Japan are hardcore into Japan. A lot like the Packers. You can't do anything in education, but you have to have a different vocation. What would kind of be appealing to David?
Oh, wow. I've joked before that I love the idea of being outside all day, and I love airports. So the guys that help direct the planes into the gates would be terrific. But also, honestly, I love working with children, and even if it wasn't in the educational context, I think one of the most rewarding things I've ever done is I was assistant coach on a soccer team for about 6 years, and just really got to know the kids on the team and their families. It was it was like a second family to me.
Nice. And this will probably be my hardest question. What's a book you've read that you'd recommend that parents read? It doesn't have to be about college. It could be about anything, or it could be about college. It doesn't really matter. But what's a book that you found very inspirational that if you were to say, "There's my book, I recommend you read"?
Yeah, wow, that's such a great question, and I do love to read, so there's a lot to choose from. But the one that I'll select, because it jumps right to the top, and I'm a big believer in that the inside of me knows better than the surface part of me, is a book called The White Castle. And it is written by Orhan Pamuk, who is a Nobel-winning author from Turkey. And there's a quote in the book that says, "A man should love his life enough to call it his own in the end." And that quote has stuck with me for probably 15, 16 years now since I read the book. And it was definitely a book that gave me a lot of perspective. So that's what I'm going to go with.
It kind of reminds me of that Martin Luther King quote. It's something like, is what you're living for worth dying for kind of thing. It's that
Exactly.
real profound thing. All right,
Yeah.
last question. What's your advice for 3 groups of people, parents, students, and college counselors?
All right. Let's go with the parents first. And this is something that our NACAC members have taught me over the years, 25 years. I think I've learned it. It's going to be tough, but let your student take the wheel. Let them take the wheel. Understanding there's a lot of considerations, finances, all that good stuff, but let them be in the driver's seat for a little while. So that's the parents. The student, that might be one of the toughest ones. So I don't envy those of you who actually work directly with students, but with my own children, I emphasize to them that think about the basics first. In terms of going to college, where am I going to be comfortable? Am I going to be comfortable in a big, huge school with tens of thousands of people, or do I need to be in a small space? So think about those things before you think about lots of other things, sports teams and other things like that. So that's, I think, keeping it simple is probably, as a starting point, is where I'd give advice to students. And then counselors, boy, I think, the one thing I learned working at NACAC, I did not realize before coming to NACAC that there was such a vibrant, robust communication between those on the high school side and those on the college side. So I think for the counselors out there, first of all, we value the work you do like you wouldn't believe. We know how much you're up against. But then secondly, do not hesitate to pick up that phone, to get to know that admission office. I've realized this is kind of the lifeblood of this enterprise, this connection between the high school counselors and the college advisors on the one side and the college admission offices on the other. So just don't hesitate, jump right in there, get engaged in NACAC and our affiliates. That'll help create that network for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dave. You've given us 2 hours of your time, and we are most grateful. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Friends, this includes the entire interview with David Hawkins, but you may or may not know this, but it's been up on yourcollegeboundkid.com for a long time. You can listen to the entire interview. It's in its entirety there. On Thursday's episode, Julie and I discuss an article entitled, "States Are Taking on Few College Cost. Who is picking up the bill?" That article appeared in Higher Ed Dive. Linda and Lisa will answer a speak pipe question, and it's about the National Merit Scholarship Program. Gloria and Terry Crawford are continuing their deep dive into helping us understand Glimpse videos with part 3 of 5. And finally, Fabrizio Delosio is back for part 3 of 5 for a deep dive into understanding the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. Friends, never forget, college is not a prize to be won. College is a match to be made. See you on Thursday. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joy Stucker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stalianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.